Hello, I'm Meia Nouwens, and welcome to another episode of Sound Strategic. In today's episode, it is my pleasure to welcome a new colleague onto the show, Dr. Samir Puri. Samir recently joined the IISS office in Singapore as a senior fellow in urban security and hybrid warfare. Samir has worked in government and in academia. He was previously the assistant head of research at the Development, Concepts and Doctrine Centre, the British Ministry of Defence's think tank. In 2017, he authored the Commonwealth Secretariat's strategy on countering violent extremism. His previous academic posts include lecturer in war studies at King's College London and adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS Europe. Earlier in his career, Samir worked for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, a secondment with the OSCE to monitor the war in eastern Ukraine, and his career began as a defense analyst at RAND Europe. In 2016, he authored an IISS Adelphi book entitled Fighting and Negotiating with Armed Groups. His latest book is The Great Imperial Hangover: How Empires Have Shaped the World. We therefore wanted to take this opportunity to talk to Samir about the evolution of hybrid warfare in recent years, the challenges it poses, and how it may differ in the Asian context. So Samir, welcome to the show.
Meia, thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here and indeed a pleasure to call you a colleague now. Having just arrived at the Institute just a couple of months ago.
So perhaps we could start with how you first got involved in researching this topic and what we mean when we talk about hybrid warfare.
So my interest in hybrid warfare began after I returned from a year working in East Ukraine, monitoring the onset of the war in 2014-15. And I can tell you this, before I went to Ukraine, on secondment, there was no talk of hybrid war as describing what was happening. When I came back, the term had diffused itself across the strategic lexicon, so much so that it was actually impossible to get away from it. And I was quite struck by the fact that every now and again in strategic studies, a piece of jargon embeds itself very much solidly into the way in which discussions unfold. It was a little bit like coercion and counterinsurgency a decade ago. You couldn't walk for two paces without, tripping over a mention of coercion. So my interest really was born from that on-the-ground experience of seeing what was, for all this sort of the novelty supposed by hybrid war, what was on the ground was actually very much a traditional conflict, which was accompanied by some, pretty innovative use of subversion as well. So that really was the sort of the personal connection to the term.
And what do you think we mean today when we talk about hybrid warfare?
I think a lot of people like to use hybrid warfare quite liberally as a tag to explain almost any act by a malign international rival. I think it's so wide now that if you think about it with a clearer head, it's starting to encompass almost every kind of influence operation, state-sponsored industrial espionage, sabotage, all sorts of things that Western states might assign to Russia and perhaps also to China in some instances as actions that are happening sort of below the radar. Personally, I think that the term the grey zone is rather more useful in sort of contextualizing the environment in which that sort of panoply of activities I've just listed unfolds, rather than hoovering it all up into hybrid war. The big distinction, Meia, with hybrid war, I think, is that there needs to be some kind of war going on. And so if you take that as sort of the starting point, then you're talking about a cocktail of some degree of conventional war or kinetic warfare activity admixed with a cocktail of subversion, the co-opting of non-state actor proxies, superficial deniability on behalf of the culpable state actor. It won't necessarily always look like Ukraine. But just going back to that experience, really there was a lot of actual warfare also going on as well.
I mean, why is that a useful distinction for policymakers to make?
It's useful because unless you have a targeted response, you may end up crafting a series of policy tools with no real sense of when they could be applied. And more worryingly, you might not be able to identify when you are the subject of a hybrid war or when one of your allies is the subject of a hybrid war. An ally could potentially, a smaller state could potentially suffer some sort of malign activity, some sort of negative information operations, and so on and so forth. Perhaps this is a harbinger of a hybrid war campaign, but in of itself, maybe it's better explained as being some sort of covert intervention, some kind of subversion tactic that may or may not be something that leads to the onset of a hybrid war. So that really is a danger, isn't it, of thinking that you're involved in something that you're not. And potentially in the world of international affairs, and especially in the sort of more intense geopolitical contests that we're now seeing, leaving your adversary sort of wrong-footed is part of the objective. So you do want to be careful you don't wrong-foot yourself by thinking something is happening when it's not particularly the case.
I mean, do you think that hybrid warfare is just a new way for great powers to wage war indirectly? Or do you think that the tactics involved make hybrid warfare plausible for any country? Is this something that any and all countries can be involved in?
Well, yeah, the question of the novelty of hybrid warfare is one that, for those of us with a historical head on our shoulders, and I include myself in that category, the novelty is pretty low. And you can pretty much disprove the novelty by just pointing at, for example, the Bay of Pigs operation in the middle of the Cold War, in which everyone knows the story. The CIA and the American government of the day paid and tried to sponsor Cuban exiles and provide them with some deniable support to reverse the revolutionary outcomes in Cuba, and it failed. Now, if you read the operational ingredients that JFK signed off on then, they're not so different if you replace, of course, the internet with radio broadcasts, and if you move the technology back a few decades. It's not so different to what the West might be seeing happening in terms of the way Russia has approached some of its operations today. I think every generation does like to find its own terminology, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. And certainly the technological revolutions that have changed all of our lives in the last 2 decades, they have to be factored in some way. And of course, the speed and reach of technology is unrecognizable even to people from 15 or 16 years ago, simply because of the advent of smartphones from 2007 onwards. So I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with having a newer term, but we should always remind ourselves that, as Mark Twain said, that there really are only echoes of past actions. The past rhymes with the present. There's nothing really new under the sun when it comes to the achievement of deception in warfare at the level of the principle of achieving deception.
I suppose my question was more about the types of actors we'll see in conducting hybrid warfare as you define it. Is it just limited to the United States, Russia, and China? Or do you think other countries are also playing a role here? We'll talk a little bit later on about China's maritime militia, but of course other smaller countries have their own, if not much smaller and perhaps less capable, less equipped maritime militia. So I'm just thinking about the diversity of actors here.
Yeah, one of the misnomers of the term great power competition, a great power conflict, is that whilst it usefully draws our attention to the Russias and Chinas of this world, there are many more, I suppose some would call medium-sized countries that are being much more assertive. Just think about Turkey and its expeditionary operations today. I mean, I'm not saying that's hybrid warfare, of course. So there are countries of differing sizes that could potentially engage in activities that meet the criteria. And since the term hybrid warfare, really, its ubiquity is really in the last 5 or 6 years. Its origins are with Frank Hoffman in 2006 with his article looking at the Hezbollah conflict. But as with the arrival of any new piece of jargon, you can backcast it to other conflicts in older theaters. And at the start of my career, I worked very extensively on Pakistan and Pakistan's own strategies within its own borders and in its region. And certainly, if you look at the Kashmir conflict, not to go down that rabbit hole, some of the ways in which Pakistan tried to offset the difference in size with India was indeed to sponsor proxies, to do so in a superficially deniable way, and to try to subvert India's claims of authority over Kashmir. That's sort of 1980s, 1990s vintage. But one would imagine if that sort of strategy was tried afresh today, that it would immediately be determined as a hybrid warfare strategy, especially because the Pakistanis also supported it with the overt use of their armed forces in certain instances as well. And another interesting parallel very quickly, Meia, on that is, of course, the Pakistanis then immediately talk of how they have suffered the use of Indian proxies in their own territory. I'm certainly minded with the fact that Russian academics, whenever the topic of hybrid warfare comes up, immediately point to the color revolutions within the Eastern European sphere, and immediately they say, well, Western academics and strategists, you say this is hybrid warfare that we're employing. What about the hybrid warfare that we've suffered in kind? And then you've got this sort of the unending debate of who started it, which, unfortunately, a lot of international disputes do come down to this somewhat, playground formulation of, well, they started it and not us. You do have, I think, in the annals of recent conflicts, several others that can indeed meet this threshold of this cocktail of state and non-state actors and subversion being used to grind away slowly at a strategic conundrum, to express a grievance by powers of both great and maybe not small, but certainly medium-sized in military capability.
That's a fantastic answer. I love the playground politics part of it. You mentioned that your first experience of hybrid warfare was from your time observing Russian-backed separatists groups in eastern Ukraine. Now that your focus is pivoted to the Asia Pacific, what are some of the differences in hybrid warfare that you're expecting to see in the region? Or are we going to see more similarities than differences?
Well, they're certainly going to be different, and the trick with strategic analysis, writ large, is you have to have the flexibility of mind to understand that while we may have principles and terminology, how they manifest in any particular context really is almost the be all and end all of that scenario. Terms like hybrid warfare, they're just there to really set our minds in motion and in the right direction. Certainly compared to what I experienced in Ukraine in 2014-15, I touched on this earlier. The equipment being used in the kinetic part of the conflict was so old-fashioned. It's real Cold War era kit. There are multiple launch rocket systems, firing quite indiscriminately at enemy positions. The actual conflict in positional terms was quite dynamic when I arrived. There was a peninsula of government-controlled territory stretching to a town called Debaltseve in East Ukraine. In my time there, that came on sustained assault, ground assault, and that was lost to the separatists. I even saw, a brace of surface-to-air missiles being fired from a Ukrainian armed forces position at Kramatorsk airport, where they'd sort of set up a HQ. I think that was, the day after there'd been a cluster bomb attack in the city that we were all based in. So, I sort of paint these quite dramatic scenes because, I do want listeners to realize that when we talk about the hybrid war in Ukraine, yes, there's little green men in Crimea. That was an episode that, of course, happened in March of 2014. The slow grind of the Donbas war, which actually grinds on to this day, albeit at a slightly lower intensity than was the case when I was there. Honestly, it was the 100th anniversary of the First World War, in fact, and I was seeing trenches and I was seeing fixed positions. I was seeing indiscriminate artillery and I was seeing armored vehicles being used in anger by both sides. So that met the criteria of being a hybrid war, meets that criteria of being the hybrid war. And yet, when you're actually there, it seemed quite old-fashioned. Moving theatre, I think we need to retain that same flexibility of mind when thinking about East Asia and thinking about how sources of tension and hotspots that we all know, for example, Taiwan, and we'll come back to Taiwan, I think, in a moment. Taiwan is not going to suffer anything that looked like the Ukraine conflict. Of course, it's separated by water, so that's one of the big differences anyway. But really, what we're talking about with hybrid war is the innovative and the surprising combination of actors and ingredients into the strategic toolkit that surprises and overwhelms any defensive arrangements that are already set in place. And perhaps even the spectre of that sort of novel combination can be enough to keep a smaller state off balance and thinking that its conventional military balance is not the only way of accounting for its ability to defend itself, and indeed for its allies to come to its defense potentially in the future. So that's not a direct answer to your question, Meia, other than to say that if the Asia Pacific is to see hybrid wars, they will look completely different.
Well, let's talk about the Taiwan example quickly. Talk me through what you think hybrid warfare would look like in a Taiwan scenario.
Sure. Well, this is actually going to feature in part of the ongoing research that I'm involved in here in the Asia Pacific region in the Asia office, and I'll be able to give you sort of a fuller answer on that in a little while. But I think one of the points of adaptation is moving the hybrid warfare model from the crossing of land borders to the crossing of maritime borders, and there's been a lot of talk about fishing and Chinese fishing fleets as potentially being a vehicle through which China can, perhaps even without any overt state involvement, lay greater claim to areas of maritime space. Now, I would never expect, to have anything as clumsy as a fishing fleet, in the shadow of a warship, sort of sailing forward. But that sort of thing may well actually be a gambit used to attract some kind of retaliatory measure. Whether that retaliation is rhetorical, perhaps that then would lead to the ability to build some kind of tit-for-tat argument over a quite ancillary issue that can then spill over into something that brings in other tools into the equation. Just thinking back as well around the possibility of using international treaties as a point of provocation. Ukraine, as we all remember, was all about the accession treaty into the European Union. That there was vacillation over signing in Kiev by the Yanukovych government, then a popular revolt to express discontent that there was feet dragging over that. Of course, there'll be no such direct equivalent, but the notion of overlapping international clubs and certainly trade clubs is a really important feature of the Asia Pacific region. Competing claims to preferential trade arrangements. Certainly, there is the potential for overlapping preferential trade arrangements to be suggested, not necessarily only to Taiwan, but to different countries in the region, and for disputes to potentially spring up around issues of economic statecraft that could potentially find some expression in hostilities. Now, how you get from one to the other, I can't give you any firm answers or roadmaps. All I can do is to present to you a potential start point and a potential sort of culminating point in a dispute, and then to convey, I think, the importance of us thinking very flexibly about that sort of spiral of descent, that potential spiral of disputes, and then apply that to different Asian Pacific contexts. So clearly, Meia, my answer is quite hypothetical, and long may it remain, and forever may it remain hypothetical. But these are some of the hypotheses I think it's quite responsible for us to actually pose, to think about what destabilization and escalation might potentially look like with a hybrid war frame in mind in different regions, in the Asia Pacific in particular.
Indeed. And just for our listeners who might not be aware or knowledgeable on the little blue men in the South China Sea operating around Taiwan, China's maritime fishing fleet, the maritime militia operates as a three-pronged strategy of Chinese maritime power projection together with the Chinese Coast Guard and the Chinese PLA Navy, of course. My question for you, though, is how do we differentiate a maritime militia from a normal Chinese fisherman?
With great difficulty, if the strategy works out well from a Chinese perspective. The confusion of attribution is something that is a permanent feature of the strategic landscape. I think for a good decade after 9/11, confusion of attribution was primarily thought of in relation to terrorist acts. A bomb would go off somewhere and there'd be competing claims as to who detonated it. We still have that reality. And I think in addition, we now have overlaid with that the intensity of regional and great power competition, so to speak. And so the idea that attribution could be confused between a commercial objective, the objective of individual entrepreneurs or business people with a particular responsibility or interest in a region, and the state, I think is a very real feature of the scenario that you've described. Again, playing that out into specifics is unwise. And I think it is actually wise when thinking about the potential for this to speak in quite general terms, because you don't want to shut your mind off from thinking about one particular way in which a scenario could actually develop momentum. But certainly the confusion of attribution is one of the underlying girders for a hybrid war approach.
Now, moving on to economic coercion, a topic that you just mentioned. China prides itself on placing economics first in its relations with other countries, which perhaps differs somewhat from how the US and other countries in the liberal democratic West engage with countries through their foreign relations, through the promotion of democratic principles to varying extents. Now that China's economic influence around the world has become more established, do you think that economic statecraft will become a more central or key aspect of hybrid warfare in the Asian context? I'm thinking here in particular of the recent diplomatic rift between Australia and China, with China essentially cutting Australian imports as an attempt to coerce a political response or to punish.
Yeah, that's the first part of your question hit upon one of my pet favorite themes, which is the extent to which powerful countries in the world have the self-awareness as to how some of their quite natural tendencies are perceived by others. But we'll come back to that point. This is around democracy versus sort of Chinese economic statecraft. Just very quickly on the Australia dispute with China. I mean, this, as we're sitting here having our conversation, this is immediately in the wake of the provocative tweet by Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman depicting an Australian soldier, a very poor CGI photoshopped style depiction of an Australian soldier engaged in a war crime that is an allusion to Australia's own inquiry into the conduct of some of its special forces in the Afghanistan campaign. See, this tit for tat between China and Australia has become pretty bitter pretty quickly. And it's remained at the realm of rhetorical jabs going in both directions, and in terms of preventing the import of certain Australian goods. This sort of dispute, I mean, this is not hybrid war. There's no warfare accompanying this dispute. This sort of dispute is going to become, I think, increasingly common in international politics and in foreign policy, certainly in the early part of the 2020s, because the world is adjusting to the fact that liberal democratic capitalist norms of discourse do not have the monopoly that they once had in the conduct of these conversations. These sorts of disputes are actually unthinkable even as recently as a decade ago, let alone in the 1990s and in the post-Cold War. And I think this gets back to that theme I mentioned at the start of my answer now, is the extent to which the powerful countries of the world have the self-awareness to see how their sort of norms and assumptions are being perceived around the world. We are definitely in the sort of post-Fukuyama moment, when whether you think that autocracy is sort of fighting a sort of a comeback for itself, certainly through Chinese and Russian models and how they're being expressed and diffused around the world, and the inspiration they provide to others in smaller countries who don't necessarily want to have free and fair elections. This really has gained astonishing momentum in the last few years. This is, of course, overlapped with a crisis of confidence in certain parts of the West, in the US during the Trump era. In the UK, some of the uncertainties heralded by Brexit. But I think one of the ways I like to look at all of these issues is through the lens of our post-imperial world. And this is a theme that we sort of mentioned at the very start of our discussion. Certainly for the economic statecraft of the Chinese, they're trying to establish a greater sway in their region and further afield with the Belt and Road Initiative, something I know you've been working on very extensively, which I look forward to talking about more in a moment. But it really is about how you achieve influence in a post-imperial world. Until not that long ago, conquering your neighbors if they are weaker than you was the rule of the political road, and that was the rule of the political road since ancient times. But the world of empires, of formal empires, came to an end over the course of the 20th century, and we have a world of informal empires where having a decisive stake in a smaller neighbor, or perhaps even a veto over their economic or political policy through a disproportionate degree of influence, that really is how you achieve the construction of an informal empire. And the Chinese would point out that the Americans have been running an informal empire based to a certain degree on economic statecraft, but also to a degree on the diffusion of military bases globally in large numbers, especially in the Asia Pacific. And the Chinese would say the Americans have been doing that since the end of World War II. So it's 75 odd years. So we've got a very well-established informal empire now butting heads with an informal empire in the making. And I think China's economic statecraft should be understood in that context.
And does that informal empire of the Belt and Road Initiative and perhaps even the digital Silk Road, I know that you're going to be working on some digitally related topics as well in your future work, does that enable greater hybrid warfare capabilities for China abroad in the future, or does it just create more vulnerabilities for Beijing?
One of the great things about hybrid war, paradoxically, is it does indicate some stability in the international system. It is a function of intense great power competition without great powers fighting each other. In other words, short of World War III, there is the possibility that China would find hybrid war style approaches to be the way in which they would want to extend a military sort of gambit in a particular theater to the tolerance of the US. And this is another phrase I find quite useful, is tolerance warfare. So it's a phrase that appears in the latest IISS strategic survey, in fact, in some of the opening pages. It's a really important phrase because, again, it's another paradoxical phrase, but it indicates that a powerful country with a series of grievances is able to engage in quite aggressive tactics, potentially even hybrid warfare, and get away with it because it's calibrated at a level below attracting a response in kind or a withering response by the US or by local allies of the target of that aggression. In terms of the options that the Chinese have got, if we think about what China's rise is currently associated with, of course, it's the Belt and Road Initiative. It's the military modernization, which is quite extensive. It's, of course, its posture in the South China Sea in terms of maritime positioning and aerial activities in the airspace. It's domestic repression in Hong Kong and Xinjiang province as well. I'm just thinking about all of the characteristics that one would associate with Chinese power as a very broad concept. And if you think from the perspective of a Chinese strategist, you've got quite a list, quite a range of different proclivities, equipment, of tactics, of mentalities, of levers that you could potentially combine in quite an innovative way in a different theatre elsewhere. Once again, this is all very hypothetical, Meia, and I do caveat this by saying that we are thinking about the strategic stability of the Asia Pacific in the 2020s, and we're thinking about the future. We're thinking about how not only the US and European allies, but countries in the region could be caught flat-footed by a sudden deterioration in relations or a sudden aggressive gambit that seems to come out of nowhere, but at the same time uses the raw material that is already somehow in evidence in front of our own eyes.
That's a great answer. Maybe just to follow up on that, do you think that the US and its allies are equally capable of hybrid warfare? I mean, we talk a lot about Russia and China, and we have in this episode. Is are Western countries equally capable, or should they even venture into this?
Well, the US in particular has a great pedigree during the Cold War of sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing to support different factions in different zones of contestation with the Soviet Union. I've mentioned the Bay of Pigs episode, which is, of course, a disaster. We all know about the operations in Afghanistan in the 1980s. But, Meia, what's happened is with the expected complacency of the post-Cold War period, with the US as the undisputed system hegemon, the heavyweight champion of the world, the necessity of engaging in covert gambits declined because the possibilities for engaging in overt gambits increased. The possibility of gaining a UN Security Council resolution as a rationale for regime change is something that we saw in the 90s. The possibility of NATO moving in as in a nation-building endeavor. Perhaps there are some voices of opposition in some parts of the international community, but in general, the West could still speak of the international community and punish a recalcitrant leader somewhere. These are some of the assumptions of the post-Cold War, post-9/11 world that we're starting to see fall away. And I think consequently for Western countries, the ability to engage in the grey zone, and indeed the desire to engage in the grey zone, to potentially counter hybrid wars with gambits, not necessarily in kind, since they would certainly need to meet the moral tests and the legal tests of Western countries, which may well be much more stringent than authoritarian countries. The need to refresh that toolkit and the mentalities around it is definitely there. And that, I think, is one of the stories of, I certainly wouldn't say we're at the end of the 9/11 cycle. We're coming to 20 years since then. And I think some of these strategic assumptions of the post 9/11 world are definitely falling away quite rapidly.
Well, Samir, I think that is an intriguing and excellent point to end this episode on. Thank you for joining us on the show. It has been a pleasure talking to you, and now also getting to call you a colleague as well. And I am very much looking forward to you helping us understand these questions and perhaps coming up with some answers through your work into the future.
Thanks very much for having me, Meia. A real pleasure.
And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. And for more in-depth analysis of the key international security and defense issues from around the world, be sure to follow the IISS on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit the IISS website. Thank you and see you next time.